Welcome to the Whose Body Is It podcast. I'm your host, Isabella Malvin. In this episode, I'm joined by Annika, a woman who formerly identified as trans, who also married a trans-identified man. We walk through her initial discovery of the trans experience and how her support of a trans-identified friend in a super religious community left her asking new questions about her gender and sexuality. She discusses her confusing introduction to goddess culture in which women-only language and spaces were challenged by trans-identified men in the group, and about the influence her trans-identified housemates had on her self-perception. Annika details her marriage to a trans-identified man who exhibited dissociative identity disorder, formerly called multiple personality disorder. She also gets into the monumental abuse she endured while isolated with him and the extreme internal resources she developed to survive, even as one of her husband's alters set plans in motion to have her killed. We cover her harrowing journey to piece herself back together after being gaslit by both mental health professionals and her husband, and her intuitive work in illuminating the trans experience as a maladaptive mechanism for internal parts work. Where does your story as it relates to, identifying as trans, where does all of that begin for you?
Oof, that's a good question. I mean, I could drop into it at different points, obviously, right? But I would say, like, as far as like the kind of trans identity or identification or trans community, I was introduced to it pretty early, I would say. Like, a lot of people kind of only got to hear about it in the last few years. But a friend of mine transitioned when I was 29. I'm 42 now. So it was in 2008, I think. And that created a huge stir because I was part of a pretty conservative Christian community. And so this person who had lived as a man, fathered, I think, 9 children,
Wow.
and then transitioned in his 50s, I think. And that was the first time I'd heard of it. Like, I think I'd seen like a documentary once as a teenager about, but I don't even think that was transgender. I think that was like an intersex thing or something. So I really didn't even know what that was. And then here, this person I've known for years, just, announces that he's a woman now. And the community I was in went crazy. I mean, there was a lot of talk of demon possession and how we might need to do an exorcism, or whether maybe the therapist was demon possessed and had caused him to,
Wow.
get influenced. So it was very much framed in spiritual terms. And at that time, I was kind of leaving that paradigm. And so I was appalled by the lack of compassion that I was seeing. There was just a lot of like hate, and it just was not pretty. And so I sided with my friend, and I was like, okay, tell me, like, I want to understand you, And so that was the first time I was introduced to the transgender thing. And I was like, wow, okay, well, I was coming to terms with my own history of, you know, um, like having told people they're going to hell for being gay. Like, this is something I used to do when I was an evangelist, and I would, tell people that they were having demonic influences on their lives and whatnot. And I came to regret some of those things. And so I thought, this time around, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to, be that person telling you you're going to hell. I'm not going to be that person who's not compassionate, but just, so throwing my belief system at you without actually seeing you as a person and as a human. So that started my introduction into the whole transgender thing, ideology, belief system, what have you. Yeah.
And it sounds like there was no kind of like turf culture within this Christian community where there was this in between. You were seeing this man be treated. It sounds like pretty badly,
Yeah.
and so that would make sense that if to kind of to side with him would mean to like also inadvertently affirm the delusion and the ideology. But that was really interesting.
I was also in the process of getting a divorce. So my spouse was leaving me, my husband was leaving me, his wife was leaving him. I was coming out of the Christian paradigm in a lot of ways.
Mm.
And obviously, he was being rejected by all of his Christian community. I was being rejected by people for getting divorced. So, we had a lot in common. We bonded. So that was, it was actually really supportive to me to have that connection. And I didn't know anybody else. So it was just this kind of unique phenomenon. I'm like, okay, well, maybe some people are just born into the wrong body. And, here's one. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it was much later that I realized there's like a whole movement and all of that. That was completely new to me at the time. Yeah.
So then that was in 2008.
I think so, 2008 or 2009. Yeah.
So then what happened after that? You totally left the kind of the church community, you got divorced. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think I remember in your message that you said that you also identified as trans at one point. Is that correct?
I did. Yes.
Okay. So then yeah, take us like where
Yeah.
so you're introduced to this guy who needs your help, you bond, you're both going through hard times, you both leave the Christian community, and
Yeah.
then what happened?
Well, it definitely brought up some questions for myself. With okay, so if some people are born into the wrong body, how do I know that's not me? Like my relationship, my first marriage was abusive, especially sexually, and I was raised, or not so much raised, but later indoctrinated with this idea that a woman's body is there for her husband to use as he wishes. So, I was like, well, what if I didn't have to deal with that? Like, what if I could not be a woman and not have to be in this role? Um, and also, I was always pretty atypical for a woman. I was excellent at math. I was, great at climbing trees. I'd lead the neighborhood kids into trouble. So like, and then there was like a religious element where it was clear that there were certain paths that were not open to me. Right. So if I wanted to become a pastor, that was not a possibility. If I wanted to become an elder, if I wanted to become a leader in certain areas, like I could be a leader of women in the women's ministry, but I couldn't lead a congregation, or there were like limitations on what I could do as a woman. And so seeing this friend transition and now have access to things that he didn't have access to before, it's like, wow, like my life could be different if I was a man. And then I started remembering how much I hated puberty, how much I despised, being looked at like an object by some men. I mean, I'm sure this is not news. Like women experience this, right? And so it opened up this idea that like maybe that was all a mistake. Maybe I didn't have to suffer all of that. Maybe I can opt out of that somehow. And so it started me kind of questioning the maybe I'm not who I needed to be my whole life, who I was told I had to be. So, and since it was the gender identity, it was introduced to me as part of the LGBTQ, etc. I mean, I was also very much anti people being homosexual. All right. And then when my friend transitioned and now identified as a woman and lived as a woman with his wife, I was like, well, now they're like a lesbian couple, right? Or at least it looked like they were a lesbian couple, on the outside. And so, now I'm eating lunch with two women apparently who are in a relationship. So it started the questioning of the whole sexual orientation as well. And so it was a package deal for me. Like I never thought to see sexual orientation and gender identity as two different things. They were just together for me. And I was done with all the judgment and the kind of narrowly defined roles and the, like men are like this, women are like that, and they get together and this is the kind of relationship they have. So it all went out the window, including the idea that I had to be a woman. So
It's interesting what you said about the remembering, which is so, I think emblematic of, the major criticism of the ideology, which is that it starts with the solution and then, the person is collecting evidence, or the parents or the gender therapists are then collecting evidence as to why it's true. So almost like a reframing of like, oh right, that those times that I felt discomfort in my body, that must be because of
right.
this, this destination that you've, has just kind of come into the periphery, which is, what, most people I think listening will know that the gender ideologues, right, will start, will kind of promote the idea that it's inherent, that it starts from the beginning,
Mhm.
that it's innate, so
Yeah.
it's interesting how you kind of looked back and then reframed and collected evidence for why this was, true. And the other thing that you mentioned that is really kind of funny is that a fake, like a not actually a lesbian couple, is what it took for you to start to accept homosexuality.
It was part of it. There were other
Part of it, yeah,
elements too,
yeah.
but it was, that was the first time when I just remember sitting in this restaurant and the wife of the couple was said she was going to go to the to Pride parade with her spouse. Diplomatically was the spouse, neither husband nor wife, but spouse. So she was going to go to Pride to support the trans, movement at Pride, but she was absolutely anti-gay people. And then she went on this whole rant about how homosexuality is sin and lesbianism is horrible. And it was just such a cognitive dissonance to see two people who looked like women sitting there with one of them going on about how bad homosexuality was.
Wow. And that is just also an admittance of the fact that he is totally not a woman, too.
I mean, it was just, I just didn't know what to think anymore. I mean, at that point, it was all new.
Oh
I
my
was in the middle of the
gosh.
divorce crisis, faith crisis, just like, I don't know what to think anymore. This is not where I thought my life was going to go. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so then you started to have the thought that this, was maybe your experience as well. And like, how far did it go? Did you medicalize? Like, what was the process?
Well, the whole gender thing kind of moved into the background after that. For a while, it was pretty prevalent while I was talking a lot to my friend. But then I started exploring other things like the faith transition, some of the relational trauma, the sexual trauma became really prevalent for me. And I was really consumed by that. So gender identity really took a back seat. And then my friend died of a heart attack at like, I think at early 60s or maybe
Oh
59 or
wow.
something like that. Yeah, so that was like only like 2 or 3 years after transitioning. And then I didn't really know any trans people anymore. So it just kind of faded from my awareness for a while. Um, and then it came back when I moved into an intentional community and I got involved with the pagan community. I
Mm,
was uh, I was really hungry for spirituality. I was triggered by all things Christian.
mhm.
I was really bored with atheism, especially like the super hyper intellectual Silicon Valley atheism that I was exposed to. And so I started looking into like the pagan community, pagan rituals. And there I found a lot of people who identified as transgender.
Mm.
That was a big, big part of the culture and the community. And so it came really back into my life. And that's when I started to question again, like maybe that's me. Maybe I should be part of this community.
Mm.
I keep hanging out with people who are trans. I keep having housemates, even who are trans. They keep doing ritual with people. I just feel like I should be part of that. Yeah.
Why do you think it was so prevalent? Like my first guess or assumption would be because there is such an emphasis on goddess culture within, you know, pagan ritual, pagan, right? That maybe there would be an inclination to want to like go to the root, like to like appropriate, like beyond kind of modern day representations or stereotypes of women, but to go to like if the infatuation for like if we're talking about men identifying as women is so strong and the fetish is so strong, then I could imagine why they would be drawn to that kind of validation. But what do you think? Why do you think it was so prevalent in those communities?
I actually think it had more to do with like people going there from Christianity. So there were so many
Um,
misfits.
I see. So it's like a
People who
landing
got,
pad, right?
yeah, like one of my housemates had gotten kicked out for being gay, and then another housemate was kicked out first for identifying as gay and then as transgender out of their parents' house.
Mhm.
So it kind of it was a magnet for people who had been rejected by their Christian cultures, communities, families. It was also in the San Francisco Bay Area, so that's where that happened for me, where I was became part of the pagan community. So there was a lot of overlap with we're the weirdos. So there's the gay,
Mm,
transgender, queer weirdos, and then there's like the pagan, not Christian weirdos. And
mm. I see. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, that totally makes sense.
yeah.
Was there any resistance within that group? Like, did you meet any like radical feminists at that time who were critical of kind of what they saw happening?
That's where I was first introduced to it. And it was confusing because on the one hand, it was the first time for me coming into a community where women were able to do things. Like I remember being at this pagan conference and we were talking about theology and spiritual ideas. And it was a scholarly discussion. And since I had studied Christian theology and religion, I was invited to the group.
Mhm.
And I just expected to be talked over and not heard and needing to repeat myself a lot. And it was really shocking for me to be treated
Mhm.
just like the men in that group. Like it was like my voice mattered, like theirs did. Like I didn't have to fight for a spot to
Mm,
say what I thought. Um, and so there was this like beautiful accepting of women and the feminine. And it was really incredible to me that I could do all these things as a woman. I didn't have to be,
mm,
a different gender. I didn't have to be a man to be heard. And at the same time, there was the transgender movement coming in and saying, well, we shouldn't have these women's spaces that are defining women as female only. So I was introduced to both at the same time, and I
mm,
didn't know about the conflict. So it was very confusing to be caught in this emerging and growing conflict between like the goddess women movement and the
mm.
queer trans pagan movement, and yeah, clashing. Yeah, and I was just very confused. And then the people that I had met that were part of my household community or part of the groups that I practiced with, they were part of this emerging trans queer, like there was even, we stopped invoking the goddess, but like the queer gods or the transgender gods, or yeah, there was like a
Who are
whole.
the transgender gods? Like, what did they just made them up, or like what?
No, I don't know. There were several rituals that were about like deities that uh, changed gender or that were both genders or something like that. I wasn't
Okay.
really part of that, so I heard about it, but I wasn't drawn to
Mhm, mhm.
those traditions. They were never
Right,
part of my spiritual journey.
right.
So I would be in rituals where they were invoked or where people,
Mhm.
instead of, like doing casting circles in her name, it was like they, them, or, you know,
Oh,
things like that. And yeah, it was all new to me. So it felt kind of wrong and confusing. I was like, wow, it felt so empowering to actually get to refer to God in the female form. That felt so amazing, like to invoke the goddess rather than the god.
mhm.
Um, and then like now we're not supposed to do this anymore, except in this group, we're really doing this again. And it was very confusing.
Wow. So then where did you go from there? You just went you lived in this kind of confusing phase, or did you kind of say like, I need to choose, like I need to
Yeah. Then
decide?
it became pretty ugly. So there was an annual convention that had really come to appreciate, the same one where I got to meet with the scholars and be accepted. And that's where like the big fight broke out over, are we allowed to have red tent rituals for females only, or do trans women need to be included in everything that is called
Mhm.
women or female? And that got really, really heated. And the people that I knew best were on the side of, we got to get the turfs out of here. Like, they're not real pagans. We don't want them in our community. They're bad. Transphobia is not okay in paganism, And so I had not really known them or met them or knew about them like
Mhm.
separately. So I then just kind of got the idea that these are the bad people, and like, we don't talk to them, we don't compromise with them.
Mm.
They just need to
Yeah.
leave our spaces, because we want inclusive spaces. And it sounded really good, coming from such an exclusive religious culture. Like, the words of, inclusion, and no, we're not going to be phobic, and we're not going to, it really tugged on my, I did that for years. I was telling people that there was something wrong with them, and that, they needed to obey, like, God, to
Wow.
go get fixed and have their sexuality fixed. And, supported gay conversion therapy.
Mm.
So it's like, I'm not doing that again. And so then I'm like, okay, we're going to be anti-turfs then, because they're just like the Christian fundamentalists that, where I come from, and I'm not going back to that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Wow, that makes so much sense, and I think, like, mm, people who haven't been in such, like, polarizing, like, super religious circumstances where they're participating in conversion therapy, even people without that remember they, like, have that fear, that impulse to not want to be called, obviously, like, phobic, but it also makes so much sense that the majority, it sounds like, were kind of going towards the trans side because, like, that's where the power was moving. I think I just spoke to Dr. Suzanne. I asked her, like, why do you think women are going along with this? And she's just gave a really simple answer, which was just that women go where patriarchy goes, women go where the power goes. And yeah, made me think of that when you were sharing. Wow. Wow. And what was this annual was this like Ruth Barrett, one of Ruth Barrett's events? Or
No, the conference was called PantheaCon. It was in
okay,
San Jose, California.
okay.
And I actually I actually don't exactly know like who the
Mm,
main players were, because they were just
right.
the turfs. Like, I mean, they were just the bad people. So like,
They never have names. Yeah, it's just the
so I'm
terms.
not even exactly sure like who was really involved in that. I just know they were the ones that we were supposed to not like.
Right. So what happened after that?
Well, I started living with several trans people in my community.
When you say
Um,
trans people, do you mean women identifying as men or men identifying as women?
both,
Both. Okay.
as well as so there were like, I had like people who had medically transitioned,
Mhm.
people who just identified as a gender, people who had identified as, and there's one person who had a different gender identity every time I saw him,
Hmm.
and different pronouns. And like, and it was all celebrated as like, the more the more crazy and weird and out there it was, the more liberated and the more beautiful and diverse, right?
Mm.
um so I was just kind of swept up in that. And I just remember this one time where we were in the car, and I think all three, there was four of us in the car, and the other three people in the car had all medically transitioned. Two of them female to male, and one of them male to female. And they were all talking about how great it is to be trans, and it was like the whole conversation was all about transness, and I just felt so left out. Like, I just felt
Mm.
I don't know, they're the cool kids. And yet at the same time, like the reasons that they were trans, like this non-conformity to these gender roles, I felt that too. So that was a moment where I'm like, I should really be part of that group. Like, I don't identify as cis. Like, it just that does makes no sense. I can't be cisgender. Like, I'm not cis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of them, and I'm not on the other side of this divide. So then, if I'm not cis, then I must be trans, right? Because there's two types of people in the world: those who are cis and those who are trans. So that's how it was presented to me. And in that moment, I was like, I'm not cis.
And what did you think of when you thought of cis? Like, what was your marker? Did you think of, the women you grew up with, or your mother, or your sisters? Like, was that the kind of the template of cis for you, or, the version of the kind of woman that you were trying to avoid, never kind of becoming?
Pretty much. I didn't give it as much thought, but it had a really strong connotation with boring.
Mm,
Like, it was,
yeah,
there were the cool, interesting, queer, revolutionary trans people, and then there were like the cis people.
totally.
It
I know
was
exactly what
not
you
really
mean.
used as a derogative or as a slur, but it just felt like,
Yeah,
the normies,
right.
like the boring folks, so yeah, it didn't even I didn't even have particular gender stereotypes attached to it,
Mm.
just kind of like blandness, boringness.
Totally. I totally feel that. And it's like the ritual of announcing it over and over and over, in every room. Like if you're in the culture, like anyone who's been around, this like trans ideology, queer culture knows that part of the ritual is to, announce yourself like all the time. So it's not enough that everyone can clearly see that you're a woman, but you have to proclaim as if it's like it's ableist in one sense because with like cis women are supposed to be so lucky like that we don't have dysphoria. Like that's how I came into it. Like I needed to be appreciative of the fact that like the image of myself in my head matches my body.
Okay.
Like, do you know what I mean? I don't know if you experience this, like, on the one hand, to not acknowledge that it's a privilege to be so connected to your body, you might be called ableist, but on the other hand, it's kind of like the bottom of the barrel when it comes to like coolness. Like you
Mm,
said, the boring, the bland.
yeah,
Um,
that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it in terms of like ableism at all. So that's a whole new way of looking at it. Um, I just knew that like there was an expectation of what cis people are like this comfort with the body and with the gender and having this gender identity of being identified with the sex, with one's biological sex and body. It's like, well, that wasn't my experience. But since there were only two types of people, I didn't really, I didn't feel particularly excited about this path of hormones and surgeries and having to be on medications for the rest of my life. That didn't sound very appealing. It also sounded very expensive and
yeah.
but at the same time, it's like, but I'm not that either. And I kept wishing there was a third thing, like there was some other way I could be, but it didn't exist in my
Mhm.
culture anymore. Like this new, culture I'd become a part of, that just wasn't. There were only two kinds of humans. Um, so I felt kind of lost and stuck in between and kept going back and forth of like, okay, I'm trans, I need to transition. I'm like, no, I don't want to transition. Okay, maybe I'm cis. No, I'm not cis. I'm trans. So there was a long
Oh
period of back and
gosh.
forth, and the intensity of wanting to transition went up and down quite a bit. And then what changed is that I married one of my housemates, um, who was a trans woman and had transitioned, medically transitioned male to female about a year or so before we met. And we wanted to start a second community. So we had an urban community in California, and we wanted to start a permaculture land-based community. And one of the easiest ways to accomplish that was to be partnered legally through marriage. And since we were planning to live our lives together and had similar values and goals in life, we weren't romantic, but we became emotionally close, and our purpose in life was close. And they identified as asexual. So, and we were polyamorous at the time. So it's like, well, I can just keep dating people and then marry someone who's asexual, and we can just, then live our lives together and be partners in life and do this community that I've always dreamed of. And, and like they would provide the money, they had a good job in tech. And I would quit my job and focus on building this community.
Right. Wow.
So I did. So I quit my job. We got married. And then we bought land. We moved out to Oregon onto our land to start the second community. And then things got ugly. Like my energy just kept going away. I just kept feeling so drained, and it felt like I was becoming more and more of an emotional support person for my spouse, which it was understood in the beginning that was going to be part of it. They make the money. I do the community in the household, so I'll cook dinner for when my spouse comes home, and I'll take care of some of that stuff, which I was happy to do. It felt like a good exchange. But then it became more and more emotionally demanding, to where I eventually felt like all my energy was going to be an emotional caregiver. Wow. For my partner. And the more I felt that, the more I felt drained, the more unhappy I felt being a woman. And the more I wanted to, like, it felt like there was a power dynamic, because there was this subtle suggestion that would come in whenever I asserted a boundary or said no that my spouse didn't like. There was these hints that, oh, well, I'm trans and you're not, so I'm more vulnerable, and life is hard for me, and you don't want to be transphobic, right? So it was really subtle at first, but it kind of like increased. And so I felt obligated, lest I'm transphobic and lest I'm oppressive to an already marginalized person. And so my boundaries just little by little weakened, and I did more and more and more emotional caregiving. And the more I did that, and the more I felt myself get drained, the more I wished that power dynamic didn't exist. And so there was a part of me, if only I transitioned too, then I wouldn't, then we would both be trans, and we could both be part of this beautiful rainbow trans community. And we would both be marginalized and oppressed. And so then I wouldn't have to put myself second, and my needs would matter too. So that wasn't a conscious thought process, although sometimes I actually heard myself think it, and then I'd just be like, that's ridiculous, and I'd squash the thought. But the dynamic was there, and so I started fantasizing about medically transitioning more and more. The more difficult things became, and the more drained I became, and the weaker my boundaries became, the more I wanted to just get on hormones, get the surgeries, just make me a man.
The dynamic that you just described, the I mean, well, it's remarkable in so many ways. I mean, it's such a fascinating, example of the ways that we, as women, I think, find extraordinarily elaborate and creative ways to survive within abusive scenarios. I think it also, reveals the naivete, in a sense, that women medically transitioned to men would have the same experience, or have some kind of accolades and power over other men which we know isn't the case, right? When men start to identify as women, their status in society remains the same because they are unchangeable as men. But in the case of women, it's not a one-to-one, but your thought process makes so much sense in that, like, finally we can be in this class together. And that reminds me of something else, that really gets me on how effective the term trans people has become, but as you know firsthand, the unique experiences of women who are identifying as men are it's a whole nother world. Like, they shouldn't even each be called trans. Like, it's just it's women who think they're men and men who think they're women. Like, they are entirely distinct groups. And even with those groups, there are distinctions and, differences, based on sexual orientation, age, class, race. But wow. So what did you decide?
Like, it gets crazier.
Oh my gosh.
It gets way crazier.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I feel so much sadness hearing, hearing that the like what you described, the kind of the slow erosion of your boundaries. That's what I was hearing you, kind of say.
That was enforced from the outside too.
Mm.
Where I would sometimes go to just kind of complain about how, like, I just don't feel like my needs matter, and I just don't feel, and I'd sometimes, share that with a friend, at one point even with a therapist. And the feedback I got is, well, yeah, that's hard, but you got to understand, trans women are really oppressed, and you got to understand, your partner has a lot of trauma and things like that. And so I would get some empathy from some people, but then I also got yeah, but you really need to be more empathetic too, which then felt like, okay, like, I should not be so needy, obsessed with my own needs. Like, I need to be more compassionate, more empathetic.
Right. And then now that would be described in terms of the therapist as, like just a gender affirming therapist, would you say?
I got it both ways. Sometimes it was around the gender thing where, well, yeah, but trans women have it really hard. And sometimes it was around trauma. Like, yeah, well, your partner has a lot of trauma. And so sometimes it was gender specific, sometimes not.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets crazier.
I'm ready.
So, so so there came a point where I'm like, I can't live like this anymore. Something's got to change. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to transition. And my partner had expressed some excitement about, oh, we could both be trans. How cool would that be? And I will totally support you. And so then when I made the choice, I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm doing this. I'm like, let's look into our health insurance and what's covered and whatnot, and I basically came out to my partner and said, I'm doing this. I'm trans, I've thought a lot about it. We've talked a lot about it. And I really think, I should be a man. I don't think I'm a woman, and I need to transition. And I expected, based on our previous conversations, that there would be a celebration and congratulations and support. And instead, my partner collapsed into transition regret. All of a sudden, I started hearing things like, well, like, the surgeries aren't really as safe as they're said to be. And, it's really not that easy. And, like, the hormones really do things to your body. I haven't been taking hormones for like a month. And I'm like, wait, what is happening right now? I was completely just in shock. And then something completely switched. And all of a sudden I was talking to a different part. And my partner, who started crying and saying, I wish I'd never done this. I wish I had never transitioned. Oh, wow. What have I done to my body? I mutilated myself. Like, I had a perfectly functional body. Like, I want my penis back. I mean, it was just, and then they started screaming. And so all of a sudden I went from like, hey, celebrate me because I'm trans, to being with a person in like reliving. I mean, it was like a flashback or something. Like it felt like I was back in that moment with my partner and screaming in pain over the medical transition that they went through. And so immediately flipped into like, okay, my partner is having like, I need to be there for my partner, right? So I completely forgot what I was talking about and was trying to hold space. And it ended up being a really long emotional experience, um, the like of which I'd never, like, I mean, I so didn't see that coming. And it was so painful to be with the amount of self-hatred and regret. And like, I've never held space for anyone going through something so painful, because because it was also directed at the self, being with someone who's had some external loss, like somebody died or some tragedy happened
Right.
from the outside to them. But this was like the self-hate of like, I did this to myself. Um, yeah. So I was in shock after that. I was like, I don't know what's real anymore. Like my whole world just got turned upside down. I had no idea. They had been celebrated as a success story. The surgery went well. They were super happy. They were just one of those people for whom transitioning totally works, and it fixed all of the mental health problems. And for 5 years that was the story. And there seemed to be no cracks in that story whatsoever. It just seemed like transitioning was just a 100% positive, successful experience. And here, all of a sudden, I'm listening to 2 hours of wailing and screaming about what they had done to themselves.
Wow.
Yeah, so I did not rush out to get hormones after that.
Sounds like sounds like it was very intense and ultimately very impactful to deter you from medicalizing. Wow. Wow. So
Yeah.
then did he stop hormones altogether? And how like at this point, what year was this like approximately? I'm just out of curiosity.
2018 or 2019.
Okay. Oh, so fairly recently. Okay. I was just trying to
Yeah.
place it within, the acceleration of, obviously what we're seeing now. But did that just like break the cognitive dissonance for you? Was that like it, or were you
No, it
still
gets
thinking?
crazier after that.
Oh god. I'm like, this is the most like suspenseful peak. I'm like, but when did it stop? Like when? I'm like,
No.
I'm along for the ride. I mean, I'm here for it.
No, it got crazier after that. My experience being with that transition regret, it was so absolutely jarring. And then after that, it seemed like it hadn't happened. I was starting to talk to this feminine way of being in my partner again. And when I tried to talk about what had just happened, I kind of got blown off. Like, oh yeah, that didn't really happen. I'm like, what do you mean that didn't really happen? That was one of the most shocking things that's ever happened
Wow.
to me. And and other instances like that started to make me wonder like what was really going on for my partner. Um and At one point I actually saw them talking to themselves in a way that was really different than how people normally talk to themselves. I mean, I talk to myself. I absolutely talk to myself. But this was like, it really felt like there were two people having a conversation,
Mm.
and that part of my partner, the way that like they experienced and expressed the transition regret, and then the part that later then came and said like, oh, that didn't happen. I was like, these are like different people. Like, what is going on? And then I remembered having read a book on multiple personality disorder some like years and years and years ago. I was like, okay, but that's ridiculous. That's really rare. There's no way I married a person with multiple personality. That cannot, absolutely, like, no, no way. So then I started looking, though. I started checking out some books from the library and doing some research. I was like, is that possible? And then eventually floated that idea to my partner. They got really upset, really offended. The next day, they came to me and said, like, I think that's actually what's going on for me. I was like, are you serious? They were officially diagnosed a month later with dissociative identity disorder. Um, so yeah, so then I was dealing with a completely new phenomenon of like, okay, so there are actually parts of the person I married who identify as women, and parts who identify as men, and parts who identify as children. And later I met parts that identified as non-human. So this whole identity
Wow.
system, this is a whole identity system. This isn't about just about gender. This isn't just about like, oh, I'm really a man, I'm really a woman. Like there's a whole complex identity system that this person is living out and living within that I am now married to. Yeah.
Did he ever become violent? I mean, how was it, more of just adapting to his kind of narcissism, or did it manifest into violence, like um leaving stoves on, like running the baths, like sleepwalking, like did it come out in any other way, or was it kind of just dealing with a lot of different personalities?
It had come out in other ways, but we had always lived in community. So all of the weird things that happened could be written off as like, oh, well, maybe it was another housemate who did that, you know? Like,
Oh.
yeah, maybe, maybe it was so and so, like, he's been having a lot of stress at work. And so maybe he's the one who forgot to do the thing or left that, So with so many people in the household, and we had
Mm.
people coming in and out a lot, we hosted a lot of events. So all of these weird things just kind of could be interpreted as the general chaos of community living. Now, when after we bought the land and there wasn't all these people anymore, there was only three of us, one other person who lived with us, and a second one. At one point, there was four of us, but we didn't have that coming and going anymore. And so all of those things became a lot more noticeable. Yeah.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense that one who cannot fulfill their own needs would need to be around either they would like maybe go two ways. They would isolate to a very drastic degree, or someone who's a bit more resourceful would see the necessity of being around people and even partnering with someone who is emotionally available, like who can hold space, who can, or in the case of roommates, do chores or pick up or cook. Or that's really interesting that it was able to go slightly unnoticed for that. Huh.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh. Since going through all of this, and I know we're not even done with the story, but have you researched like the frequency, and has there been any research on the frequency of like the rate of, what's diagnosed in a clinical term as, dissociative identity with trans gay? Yeah, I didn't think so. That would that would be an admittance of trans of as something other than an innate like soul identity. So that.
No, I mean I looked. I That was the first question of like,
Right.
okay, so is that a thing? Like how many people have DID, as it's called, dissociative identity disorder, and then transition because they think that that's what's
Mm.
going on for them. Um, couldn't find couldn't find any research on it. I did, however, like I did join several support groups for spouses, partners, loved ones, family
Mm.
members of people with DID, and the prevalence of people who had transitioned and detransitioned and retransitioned and detransitioned again in those communities was, I mean, sky high, sky high. Like there were
Wow.
so many people in the DID world who would be like, well, my male alter thinks that I should transition, but my female alter doesn't. And I just can't, like they keep fighting. And, we started on hormones, but then we stopped hormones again because this alter switched in, alter being an alternate identity or alternate personality.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so, people transitioning back and forth in the DID community and sometimes medically back and forth.
Wow.
It was shockingly common to see that in the DID support groups and online communities.
Gosh, it makes me so sad. The lack of community in all its ways, the destruction of goddess culture has led to you know this feeling of not belonging and this impermanence, and then we have the diagnostic manual for mental, with quotes, mental illness, none of this would even be possible without the medical technology. Like there wouldn't even be an option
Yeah.
to go back and forth and to even that we are resourceful enough as a society to even have these circles, like holding this container for this totally modern synthetic like phenomena. It's just wild. But that is so interesting and makes sense that would be true. Okay, so I'm sorry, I took us off the path. I'm just like my mind is racing with
I'm
more
used to,
thoughts and
I've lived
questions.
it. Well, I've lived it, so to me, this is normal now. But when I put myself back just 5 years ago and imagine hearing my own story, I'd be like, I don't even know what to ask next. So I get that all the time when I share my stories. Like, and I mean, it took me quite some time to integrate all these new experiences into my worldview. So I'm used to it now, but I totally get that that's like a whole other world.
It's
Yeah.
nuts. It feels familiar in the sense that I'm really critical about the way that like even gender dysphoria has been pathologized. I think Jennifer Billick wrote a piece about this recently, that the parents of ROGD kids has become its own identity.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Like, or she poses the question and she's like, has this become its own identity? Like
Okay.
from the pathology, like comes the parents and like all these other industries start to emerge just in relation to the pathology of, what I would call a healthy rejection of gender stereotypes,
Mhm.
even the term gender disorder. But okay, so I digress. So okay, so you're in these support groups. What happens there and thereafter?
Well, I met 18 identities over the course of the next year. Those were like the ones that were distinct enough that they had their own name, and some of whom thought of themselves as their own person, who shared the body with another person. Some didn't actually realize that they were part of a DID system and just thought they lost time in between switching in and out. And so I basically lived and breathed DID for the next year plus, and just getting to know these different parts. And based on what I was reading on how to support somebody with DID, I started referring to the different parts by the names that they chose or, like had,
Hmm.
and also the pronouns. So it was an interesting, like I never thought about it at the time, but I would be referring to the same human being constantly by different names and by different pronouns. Um, because I was identifying male alters and female alters and child alters. And so I was um, constantly responding to like different parts, I mean, up to 18. And that's kind of what I was told to do by the support groups and by the literature. I was like, well, you need to meet that person, treat each alter as its own person, basically. What nobody told me is that that was going to have an impact on my own mental health. So I mean, it did work for them as a DID system, to for me to be the mom when the child part switched in, and for me to be,
Wow.
the girlfriend when a girl part switched in. So it really worked for them, but it kind of destroyed my ability to have a life of my own. And I was always reacting to another person. So I was really not choosing how to be in the world anymore. I was just responding.
Mhm.
So I actually believe that, like that creates a nervous system response. So there's a fight, flight, freeze. If we can't keep freezing, we go into fawn or like appeasing. I think there
Mhm.
needs to be another one, and it's fragment. Because
Mm.
if I'm constantly just appeasing this persona and then that identity, I'm basically constantly fawning in different ways, and it will fragment my own
Mm.
sense. And that is exactly what happened. I ended up fragmenting, and I started thinking of myself as multiple.
Wow.
Some of those parts in that system were very abusive. You mentioned violence earlier. They were really good at only hinting at violence and threatening violence so that they could maintain the image of being a good person.
Mm.
So I was not like, I didn't experience physical violence, but I experienced a lot of suggestions and threats
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
violence. So yeah, I was in a constantly activated state, and then I learned to respond to the different parts in ways that kept me safe, in ways that I was expected. So it started to fragment my own sense of self. When I sought help from a therapist, the therapist suggested that I have DID, which was very unhelpful because I don't, but I believed it. So I started to identify. I was now no longer identifying as transgender. I was now identifying as having DID.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
But there was no one there to hold you in that.
no. And I started isolating, actually, with my therapist's encouragement. My therapist told me that I should distance myself from community and friends, and that I was going through what did she say? Like this was part of like a spiritual awakening process or something, and that I should only really trust maybe two or three people, starting with my spouse. And when I said that that didn't
What?
feel right and I don't trust them, she like led me through a trust building exercise of like eye gazing, and kept saying like, see, you can trust your spouse. See, you can trust her. She's there for you. She has your back. And so I kind of got trans like induced into trust that, like, I mean, my body was screaming no, like, this is wrong. But started, like, the therapist led me through altered states, and so I then, I lost my ability to self-regulate and to like govern myself, really. So I became very dependent on the therapist and my partner telling me what was real for me and who I was, even. Yeah.
Wow. So did you take her advice? Did you isolate?
I did. I didn't want to, and I tried not to.
Mm.
But that's actually how I started fragmenting.
Mm.
I felt like that fight against that. It happened in my therapist's office, where I was fighting against what I kept being told was real. And I kept feeling like there was something really unsafe. I kept thinking there was a part, in an alter in my spouse's system, that
Mhm.
was
Mhm.
really unsafe for me, and that I needed to physically protect myself. And my therapist was telling me that I was being delusional, and that I was, what is she diagnosed me with, like paranoid psychosis, I think, or something, for being afraid of my partner. Um, and so in that struggle for what's real, like, I felt a tearing sensation in my mind, while I was in a session with my therapist and my spouse at the same time. And I felt this tearings. Like it was like a like a muscle tearing, except it felt like it happened in my brain. And after that, I started to think of myself as having multiple personalities, and I started experiencing myself switching between different states of self. Yeah.
Wow.
So I'd like to say, like, I have been insane, and I mean it. I mean, that was insane. I was insane. I was once I started switching between different personas and realities, I no longer had a coherent hold on reality. So, yeah, to insanity and back.
Then how did you come out of it?
So after that breaking, after that fragmenting, I lived with my partner for another 6 months, and I started giving names to my parts, to my alters. One of them was male, and so when I was in that part, I wanted to be referred to as male because I was a man of that identity. And then I'd switch to like the woman in me and the child in me. And so for 6 months, it was a struggle between our two systems basically for control. Like I had already been under their control, and then I would try to switch to, like, if they were in a child part, I would switch to a parent part, then I would have control, then they would switch to an abuser part, then I would switch into a victim part, so then they would have control. And so we were doing that for about
Wow.
6 months.
Whoa, wait, okay. This is you okay. The way that I'm hearing this, the way that I'm making sense of like how the mind would do this is like because of the normalization of mental illness and dissociative identities and trans identities, like it sounds like in this scenario of being with this abusive partner with multiple personalities, who's identifying as a woman, who's identifying as a child, like the attempt, it sounds like, was to create some kind of dominance, like where you could like the mind created this DID so that you could attempt to exert power, have power within this abusive situation and protection.
No, and protection, yeah. So, I would switch to, there was one part that I would switch to that could not be gaslighted. It's
Yes.
just, I just felt what was real. And all rational thought would just go away. And I would just be in this feeling, very childlike self part. And all I could see was real and not real. I like it and I don't like it. I couldn't talk like an adult anymore. Like my speech became reduced to, child level. My mannerisms, I really did start to look like a child. I'd be like, I don't like it. Like, I don't like it. I started acting like that. I could see myself acting like that and I couldn't control it. It's like, okay, I guess I'm just a child now. Um, but it made me immune to gaslighting in that part, made me susceptible to other things. It also evoked kind of a protection because now I'm like, this cute little vulnerable girl, please don't hurt me, you know, which would bring out protector parts in my spouse rather
Wow.
than abuser parts. Um, yeah, there was this like constant shifting around and back and forth. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, thank you for naming the protection. And yeah, it's like it's wise. Like the even the it doesn't sound like it was pleasant. Like every step of the way, you are never trying to hurt yourself throughout this whole experience. Your mind, it sounded like, was constantly coming up with incredibly intelligent, somewhat elaborate ways to ultimately, save yourself.
Yep.
Wow. So then you're in this DID space with your spouse. What changes?
So they ended up going to an inpatient treatment facility that was supposed to specialize with DID, like it was supposed to be specifically for DID. It was a disaster. I was it was awful, absolutely awful. One of the parts of my partner convinced the staff at that center that the problem was that I was abusing them, and that the reason they were having such a hard time is because they were in an abusive relationship with me. And so then the staff basically tried to teach them how to protect themselves against me as the abuser. So they learned a bunch of new skills and tools how to control me. And the staff actually lied to me too. I was like, this can't be happening. I was like, this can't be happening. But they lied to me about the whereabouts of my partner. And so, because they were trying to protect my partner from the domestic violence that was supposedly coming from me. So that didn't help matters at all. Um, they were supposed to like stay there longer, but came back after a month. And after that, things were like a complete mess. I mean, we were severely trauma bonded at that point, and
Mm.
it's like we had practically merged into one multiple identity system. Um, like there was barely any separation between us anymore. Like I didn't even know people could merge in the way that we ended up merging. That was beyond classic codependency. That was a real just collapse of like two individuals into one very, very trauma driven mess. And that then there's a whole lot in there that's like a can of worms that would have to be a separate conversation, because like things got so insane that it rewrote my whole understanding of how humans work and how reality works. So it gets pretty esoteric
Mm.
there. So I'm gonna skip over that part because that would really have to be its own conversation. Um, in the end, a part switched in that confessed to having tried to murder me, like just like had set plans in motion to get me killed. Um,
One of his parts.
One of his parts, yeah. It was a male part too, and he switched in, and he was incapable of lying. He was like the kind of he didn't care how he impacted people at all, but was brutally honest about everything in the way that nobody's honest like that. I mean, it was just absolute. There was just no deception in that part whatsoever. But he also didn't care, and he was like, yeah, well, trying to just figured like this needed to end, and there are parts that are too attached to you, so we couldn't get away from you, so we figured we just had to kill you. But it hasn't worked out, and I'm not as motivated to kill you anymore. But yeah, like you were aware of that, right? We were trying to kill you, right? And it was like that was like I had felt it actually. There had been a sense that there was another part. And this is actually what I felt when I sat in my therapist's office. Like it was that part. And I mentioned that. I'm like, you've been planning this, haven't you? Like this part of you, like as I was talking to this part. And I said, you've been planning this. And he said, yeah, totally. The other parts kept sabotaging me, but I've been planning it for a long time. So that sense of dread that I would get that my life is in danger, it was
Mm.
because my life was in danger. And it was not because I had a paranoid psychosis. It was because my life was in danger.
Right.
Um, and so that was, we separated like really quickly after that part had switched in. That, yeah.
Meaning that you left him.
He actually left me. I
You.
was I was completely not capable of anything anymore. Like at that point, after he switched in, like there was a breach of boundaries that happened, and that was so severe, like reduced me to functioning like a child. I mean, I was completely like I was not able to function at all anymore. And so at that point, he left me in a state of barely able to care for myself. I was functioning at like child level.
Wow.
Thankfully, like my best friend and like who was there for some of that, like he kind of came and like supported me to at least function again. But I couldn't have left. I was way too broken to, and our worlds were so entangled that like I couldn't. I'm glad he did. Like, at the time it felt awful, but I'm
Yeah.
actually glad that he left. And when he left, it felt like it felt like another tearing. Like I didn't even know which pieces were mine anymore and which were his.
Mm.
And it took another 6 months after that to like to function, like to feel all these pieces that were mine come back and feel like I'm a person again who doesn't switch between
Mm.
identities. And during those 6 months, whenever I was switched into that male identity, I tried to transition. So I had no longer had a social circle anyways. And so I'd find new groups. And in those groups, I would be switched into this male part and I would just introduce myself as a trans man,
Mm.
because I was completely convinced. I could kind of still sense the other parts, but they didn't matter. And so I was then convinced I was a man. And so I would go around just introducing myself as a man in various social circles. And I was completely convinced I was. I mean, I didn't like. I would just scoff at people who couldn't see that. Like, are you stupid? Of course, I'm a man.
Wow.
So the fascinating part was even without presenting particularly masculine, I was so convinced of myself as a man that people refer to me even if I didn't tell them. Like sometimes I would just be switched into that part and people would address me as sir and just assume that I was a man. Then they would see my breasts and they would, see my face and they would feel confused. But my self conviction and the complete suppression and dissociation from all parts of me that were not identified as man was so powerful that people got sucked into that delusion and they actually believed I was a man, even if I didn't tell them. Um,
Do you think it's that they really believed that you were men, or that they had just been conditioned to respect and or obey or appease, and because you were incredibly confident, that's why they were
Arrogant.
unwavering?
Both. I think both. Like there would be an initial moment where they genuinely believed. Then they'd look at my body and go like, wait a second,
Well,
what just
that's
happened? And
right.
then it would switch from like a genuine like, oh, this is a man to like, oh wait, that's a female body.
Right.
And then there would either be a correction to, oh, okay, this is actually a woman, or it would be a, oh, but maybe this is a trans man and I have to treat him as such. And so I'm going to go refer to him as him. And, I'm going to
Mm,
pretend like I'm going to go with it, even though I've seen the female body now.
yeah.
But there was an
Yeah.
initial moment where people actually believed. It wasn't very long, but it was there.
I hear what you're saying. Yeah, it's like the more that we repeat the mantras, the more indoctrinated we are, the more our instincts become blurred and the easier it is to pretend, like part of my fear, one of my fears about all of this is the redundancy of the pretending and what the effect that has psychologically. So one part of me is like, no, there's no way they could have thought that you were a man. And then on the other hand, I hear what you're saying, that there's that initial kind of, that is so dangerous. I mean, in Abigail Schreier's book, she mentioned this Holocaust survivor who had pretended, not to be Jewish for so long. And she was, asked to speak at Holocaust memorial events and, about her life. And she would get on stage and say, well, I'm not really Jewish. Like I don't
Fascinating.
really feel Jewish. She had pretended, to be Catholic or Christian, to survive for so long that she felt neither, Christian nor Jewish. And she brings that case up in the book Irreversible Damage, because she's trying to relay how serious social transition is. you
Mhm.
know, versus the trans rhetoric, which is that, just, we'll delay medicalization, but social transition, it won't hurt anyone. They're not going to hurt their bodies. Let's just see how it goes and give them a different name. And it's like instilling this dissociative identity disorder. I mean, it's like textbook, it's also textbook like child pornography grooming, to give the kid another name, to give them a new outfit, to constantly, tell them about experiences that are distinct from what their bodies are doing. Like it really breeds the kind of experience. It sounds like that I think your spouse went through, and that by proxy sounds like you went through as well. I mean,
There's a there's a way to there's truth in the reflection that I got that people need to be met where they're at, but it needs to be fully consensual and it needs to be fully conscious.
mm,
Now, I do think that somebody, I mean, I know, like from having been there myself, like I needed to be met where I was at. Like I needed someone to meet my male part as a male part, my female part as a female part, my child part as a child part, but consciously and consensually. It needed to be a ritual, basically.
mm,
So if there was okay, so this part of you, like we're meeting with this part of you, like I can see the whole of you, but right now I'm going to step into this part with you. And in this part, you perceive the world like this.
yeah.
I needed that. Like that was really, really helpful to just not have somebody pressure me to change my perception of reality, but to meet me in it, but
Mm,
not pretending like that was real either. So it's like we have
right.
these two things of
Yes.
either no, this is real, you got to come to reality, or validating the delusion. And it's got to be neither. It's got to be like stepping into the delusion with someone while being anchored in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's the third path. And whenever somebody was able to do that with me, to say, okay, well, I don't think that this is real. Like I don't. This is not where I'm coming from. Like there are other parts of you, but I'm going to relate to this part of you and just get to know what it's like to see the world through this part. That's when integrations happened. That's when I was able to reintegrate my
Mm,
parts and come out of a delusion and more aligned with reality. Like I get where the whole trans ideology is trying to go. It's like it's trying to do parts integration work, but by
yeah.
controlling other people. Like it
Mm,
doesn't work. Like I
mhm,
needed people to reflect back this masculine part of myself, but it didn't work when I told them, I'm a man, you need to use this name for me, and you used to say he, him. Like it didn't work. It felt good in the moment, but then it would fizzle out because I mandated it. Like I told them how to see me. I didn't get that reflection back authentically.
mm,
Whereas when somebody said, okay, well, I still see you as a woman, but I can see these masculine qualities in you, and I can see how important this is for you, and I can see how you're conceptualizing your masculine qualities. Like, I want to know more about this. Share with me how it's like for you. And so then I got this masculine part reflected back to me authentically,
mm,
and I also got to hear what it was like for the other person to experience this part of me and experience me in this way. And that led to the integration. That led to healing. And so I think the trans ideology is trying to do that, but
mm,
it's using control and coercion rather than, the vulnerability of being open to hearing other people's impact and being open to having an authentic reflection, even if it hurts.
mm. Wow. I'd never heard it framed in that way, that it's this like integration parts therapy, because I've done NLP trainings. I do parts therapy and persona play with nearly every woman that I coach. I use the persona play for myself. That's how I learned. what it was about by meeting those parts of myself, playing with the personas, having those, personas be interviewed, blowing them up, giving them names, always knowing that this is not literally, I'm not going to live my week as this persona, but that this persona is a part of me and is coming up and is presenting to
Mhm.
be healed, right? Just
Right.
as you've said. So that's wow. That piece of information, I mean, I'm feeling really, really hopeful in this moment, but for parents to have that
Mhm.
nugget, that not just nugget, that kind of profound connection that you just made. Whew. Have you ever thought about, you know, training therapists on how to be decent humans?
I mean, this is the first time I'm speaking on this in public.
Wow.
Like, so, it's gosh, like the fear of reclaiming my voice after all of that,
Mhm.
it's taken a while to recover, like, and get my courage back, you know? I can totally see that. And I mean, it's so what I want. I want what I went through to be a gift to others. Like, that's literally what I want most in life. Exactly how this is going to show up, I don't know yet, but being able to gift the insights that came from that, and like what I've learned on how to reintegrate these pieces. I did it alone. At this point, I didn't trust anybody anymore. Like, I had nobody. My best friend, bless his heart, he saved me from like killing myself through sheer dissociation. I mean, I did some really, really high risk things without realizing how high risk they were. Like,
Mhm.
jumping on a tractor that was like running down the hill, and not
Mhm.
realizing that I wasn't this male martial arts trained Indiana Jones. I really thought I was. So I did like stuff that was way outside of the capacity of my body to actually do. And he kind of like kept me from like killing myself, and
Mhm.
came over when I couldn't sleep and was absolutely delusional about who was coming for me. And like, he kind of held down the fort in the physical realm, but the actual reintegration of the parts, I didn't let anybody near me. I was like, I'm doing this myself this time, because I don't trust
Mhm.
anybody, especially
Mhm.
not therapists.
Oh my god.
So I ended up developing, like, documenting my own process along the way. And some of it I found out later exists. Like, I had never heard of internal family systems,
Mhm.
IFS. I later found that some of the things that I invented exist in IFS. I was like, oh, they use different words, but that's what I
Yes.
did.
Yeah.
And then there are a few elements where I'm like, I haven't seen this anywhere else yet.
Mm.
And so I do feel like there are some new elements that I'm bringing back from this journey too. And yeah, sharing those is, I mean, that's why I'm doing this, like, to, as a part of reclaiming my voice, reclaiming my story as my own, and then being able to bring that into the world.
I'm like moved to tears. I mean, it's really remarkable. I mean, I assumed from how well you speak about your experience that you're certainly a writer, which it sounds like you are based on the kind of documentation that you shared. But it's unbelievable. Yeah, I'm just thank goddess that you made it through and are here to share your wisdom. This is like you are pioneering like a whole model of recovery for something that we've never been through in a lot of ways. There's
Mhm.
no formula for this.
There's one here.
I
I
mean,
call
you
it a
have it. I mean, you have it, but it's not in any textbook at this given point in time. Oh, wow.
No, I have, like, for a while I looked like the mad scientist. I had 5 whiteboards. My friend kept buying me more and more whiteboards. I had all these permanent markers in different colors, and I'm trying to conceptualize
Yeah.
what it is I'm doing. I was like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm doing this thing. This is how I'm integrating these parts. There's a process here. Like, I'm seeing the same patterns. I'm seeing what works. I'm seeing what doesn't work. So I have,
Mhm.
like, lots of like whiteboard doodles that I've collected in a folder.
Mm.
And they're now starting to coalesce into a coherent model that makes sense outside of my own brain. Like I keep testing it. I'm like, this makes sense to you too. And
Mhm.
so there is a model emerging. I'm calling it reeling, like reeling cycles, like
Mm.
REALING, even though it does feel like reeling. There's
Mm.
like, it comes in cycles. And so there's cycles of moving more into reality and coming into realness. And so
Wow.
I found myself going through these reeling cycles.
Mm.
And that's what I'm basing my model on.
Wow. Is there anything else that you want people to know?
The one sentence I emerged with, like the message that's now in giant block letters on the back of my car and everywhere, is there's nothing wrong with you.
Mm.
There's nothing wrong with you.
Thank you so much, Annika. It's such a pleasure to talk to you and to meet you and to hear your story. And yeah, thank you for making contact and making this happen. And thank
Yes,
you.
there's one more person who wants to say hi.
Oh, thank you, Kat.
Cool. Thank you.
Oh. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support my work, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To stay in the loop for my latest coaching programs, hypnosis sessions, free resource guides, and more, follow me on Instagram at whosebodyisit and visit my website, whosebodyisit.com.